Unit 2, Coordinate Geometry, Topic 3, we're going to talk about finding the other endpoint. So notice the last class or last video, you learned about how to find the midpoint when you were given two endpoints. I'm working with the same the same idea and the same picture, but now I'm going to give you an endpoint and a midpoint, and you're going to have to find the other endpoint. So basically, instead of giving you the full segment, I'm going to give you just half of it, and you're going to have to double what we're doing. Before we were given the full segment and cutting something in half, but now we're going to work on doubling. Okay, so from a graph, let's plot first like we usually do. So if A is an endpoint of AC, B is 0, 2 is a midpoint of AC, what are the coordinates of the other endpoint? What's really important is these problems are going to start mixing up, and you have to recognize, okay, what am I solving for? Am I solving for a midpoint, or am I solving for the other endpoint? And in this problem right here, I'm solving for the other endpoint. So plotting my points, I have negative 3, 2, that's right here. That's A. And then B is 0, 2, that's right here. Okay, and I'm going to connect that line segment. And remember, that's only half, sorry, A disappeared. That's only half of my line segment. Okay, so how far apart are A and B? A and B are 1, 2, 3 apart. So if that half of my segment is 3, it's the midpoint. The other half of the segment has to be 3. So I'm going to double it and count again. 1, 2, 3. And that's where my other endpoint, C, should land. Okay, so let's write those coordinates. Point C is positive 3, positive 2. All right. If GI has a midpoint of H0, 0, another way I could have said that is its midpoint is the origin, and an endpoint of negative 5, 4, what are the coordinates of the other endpoint? So again, recognizing that you're solving for the other endpoint here. And let's plot. H is 0, 0. That's right here. And G is negative 5, 4, left 5, up 4. That's G. And I have this half of the segment. Now remember, in the last video we learned we can't count how far apart these are when it's slanted like that, because it doesn't like cut through those boxes evenly. So we count both vertically and horizontally when we do this. So from G to H, we're going down 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And we're going right 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So down 4 and right 5. Well, that was from an endpoint to a midpoint, so I need to double that, right? I need to again go down 1, 2, 3, 4, and again write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I land right here. That's point I, and there's the rest of my segment, okay? And so I's coordinates are 5, negative 4. Okay, so that's from a graph. The only other method that we're going to go over is how to find this from a table, because I find that that's easier than using the formula. If you're someone who wants to use the formula, please go see your teacher, and he or she can explain how to use the midpoint formula to solve for the other endpoint. But let's go over the table method now. Alright, so using a table, if one of the endpoints of a line segment is 2, negative 2, and the midpoint is 4, negative 6, find the other endpoint. So this is the setup of a table is pretty familiar. Again, recognize you're finding the other endpoint. Okay, remember the left is X, the right is Y, and what's going inside the box here is our midpoint. Okay, I'm going to draw a little picture just to help us like visualize what's going on. So I have two endpoints, and then this box in here will be the midpoint, right? So now, unlike before, we actually know the midpoint. So I can fill 4, negative 6 right in there. And then I know at one of the endpoints, so I'll put that up top, that's 2, negative 2. Okay? So just like we did on the graph, we're going to find the distance between the midpoint and the endpoint. So to get from a 2 to a 4 in the x direction, that means I would add 2. So basically, I've given you this chunk here, and we know that the second part of that has to be equal, okay? Which means that I can just repeat exactly what I did from an endpoint to a midpoint. I'm going to add 2, the same thing, to get to my other endpoint. So 4 plus 2, that's going to get me 6. And then we can repeat it again. Negative 2 plus, actually, sorry, that's minus 4. That will get you to a negative 6. And then since we have a midpoint and we know these two parts are equal, if I've subtracted 4 from one endpoint to the midpoint, I'm going to subtract 4 again and do minus 4. Negative 6 minus 4 is a negative 10. And my midpoint, or sorry, excuse me, my other endpoint is 6, negative 10. And there's my answer. Okay? Let's look at one more example. But before we do that, we can actually connect this to what we did in the last video. If I look at endpoint to endpoint, right, that would be plus 4. 2 plus 4 is 6. And notice those were each divided by 2, like we did. So it should confirm that whatever it is from endpoint to endpoint, you are halved going from like endpoint to midpoint to endpoint again, okay? All right, so let's look at the next one. It says line segment CV has a midpoint L, negative 2, 4, and an endpoint C, negative 7, negative 3. Determine the coordinates of the other endpoint. Remember, it's very important. I'm solving for the other endpoint. So a lot of you might do this at first. All right? And I want you to think about the mistake that I made for a second. Okay? I assume that because this was the first point that was given to me, I'm going to put it in the first box there. However, that first point that I gave you was the midpoint, right? So I actually wanted to put that XY in the box like we're used to. So be very careful. That's a pretty common mistake. And then I'm going to put my other endpoint up top. That's negative 7, negative 3. And let's find the distance between the x's and the distance between the y's. So the distance between the x's, negative 7 to a negative 2. That would be plus 5. And then I can repeat it. Plus 5. Negative 2 plus 5 is a 3. All right, let's look at the y's. Negative 3 to a positive 4. That means I would have added 7. 4 to plus 7, do the same thing. That gets me 11. And my answer for the other endpoint V is 3, 11. And I am done. Okay? You should be ready now to do homework number 2.1, I believe it is, where it's going to be a mixture of finding the midpoints and finding the other endpoints. And good luck.